those two parts of the college. But you can imagine that, you know, if I claim that the election result is Lincoln won, and I took a really big random sample, in that sample Lincoln didn't have a majority, I should keep looking at more ballots. But eventually, if you see a large enough majority for Lincoln in a large enough sample, that ought to convince you that there's really no point to looking further, that if you were to continue to count ballots and look at all of them, you would only confirm the outcome. You would only find one right. So heuristically, that's what's going on. You're looking at ballots at random, you're assessing the evidence that they give you about whether the outcome was correct. If they don't give you strong enough evidence that the outcome is right, you keep going. Until eventually you might do a full hand count.
And when you make that decision to keep going, do you start again to roll the dice?
You keep going in the same sequence of random numbers. You go to the next number in the sequence. It turns out that restarting the random number generators is not, it can hurt their properties.
But it looks as if your procedure was, you're gonna follow this until you get either essentially a statement saying, we think it was correct, or you can also get a statement saying, we think it's wrong, therefore we go to the full hand count.
So basically, you keep at any point you'd like, you can cut to the chase and just do a full hand count. Because that's never going to, that may be unnecessary work, but it's never going to make the outcome wrong.
Right.
So the failure mode there is you spend too much. The failure mode there is not, you get the wrong answer. So the basic idea is you keep looking at ballots until either you have convincing statistical evidence that continuing is pointless, or until you put all of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
One thing in what you just said, if you think it's wrong, and this is part of, he's careful about what he's saying. If you think it's wrong, he's looking for, we are not confident that it's right. If it's wrong, then you're not going to be wrong. If you think it's wrong, then you're not confident that it's right. And his.
So you either keep going, or you could cut to the chase and say, I've already looked at enough ballots that it's clear that it's going to be more work, thank you very much, to try to confirm it statistically than simply to count it all by hand. So for logistic reasons, I'm just going to cut to the chase and do it by hand. And that can be the case even if you for example, suppose, I think that the trade-off, thank you very much, between where it's probably easier and faster to just count the whole contest by hand is when you have to touch more than about one ballot in 5. So I think if the sample size gets to be beyond about 20% of, it might be 10% and it might be 25, but on that order of magnitude, you might as well just suck it up and count them all by hand, because it's just not going to be...
You don't have to sample them.
Exactly.
Which is nice.
You don't have to go dig through and count in, or whatever it is. So there's some threshold where it's just less work to do the whole thing.
Now, I could have sworn in that paper that you said, okay, if capital T becomes greater than 10 or something, then you become convinced, and if it's less than 0.9, then you stop and do the full
So
count.
that's the ballot polling piece, and you can use it in that mode where it's sort of like, if it gets to be strong evidence that the outcome is wrong, you might as well cut to the chase. Or if you get to the point where it's clear the amount of work you're going to need to do doesn't justify continuing the sampling, you might as well. But either way, anything that leads you to do the full hand count can't possibly harm you other than economically.
Assuming that the hand count is accurate.
Assuming the hand count is accurate, yes.
And one reason I point that out is that I have 3 times observed the 1% audit every time there were mistakes. That fortunately were caught. Those were the mistakes that were caught.
There hasn't been enough work on the relative accuracy of different methods of hand counting. Different counties do it differently. The counties that I've worked with have typically used 4-person teams. One person looks at the ballot and speaks what he thinks the ballot says. The person looking over that person's shoulder jumps in and says, "No, you're wrong. It says this." If that's what she thinks, and then two people are independently tallying, and they check their tally every so often against each other, so they don't get too far down the road after a mistake. There are some jurisdictions that use the sort and stack and then count the stacks. There's some evidence that that's not as accurate.
Really?
But not a lot. I mean, I think clearly, whatever it is you do, you really want to count it more than once by hand. None of the other, I agree.
Now, you're saying you reach a point where you decide, well, you might as well do a full hand count. There are no rules spelled out. If this is going to go into law that you use a risk limiting audit, you need to spell all of these things out. don't you?
Nope, not that. Because the local election official can make an economic decision at any time to proceed to a full hand count, and it can't do any harm.
Right.
So if you can give suggestions, sort of saying, in our experience,
Right.
you might as well go ahead and do it when you get to this point. But the point is, that for the audit to be risk limited, for it to meet the definition, it has to have a high chance,
Right.
of going to a full hand count
Right.
if the outcome is wrong, if that would show that the outcome is wrong.
Right.
That's all it needs. How you get there, if you want to do that because you're just going to hand count completely every time, that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So one of our concerns generally in this work is transparency.
Mhm.
Right.
And some members in the past had said, when they've observed audits, that this is not transparent. The public and the ROBs don't understand what's going on, really. They're
The average voter
taking the
definitely would.
statistician's word for it.
Well,
In your mind, is it,
Yes and no.
can it be made comprehensible to?
Joe Sixpack.
I mean, I think there's two different pieces of it. So one is the procedure transparent? That can people observe the pieces that matter and check that they were done correctly? You don't need everybody to be able to check that the theorem is a theorem. You don't. You need to have people you trust check that the theorem is a theorem. You don't necessarily, I mean,
So there is a trust involved here. It's trusting an expert.
That's why I asked him the question, has it been reviewed?
Oh,
I mean, it's been reviewed by other experts.
Right.
Right.
yes, after performing the secret handshake to make sure we're all.
Skull Bones, you remember?
The terrorist fist bump.
That's it. That's it. I mean, the proof is out there for anybody to read. Anyone who wants to learn enough math to check whether the proof is a proof can do that. If you want to trust the refereeing system, you can do that. If you want to trust your favorite pet mathematician to check the math, you can do that. If you want to learn to do it yourself, you can do that. There's no secrets,
yeah.
right? It's all perfectly transparent. It's not like it's relying on some hidden technology under the hood that you don't get to look at. But we rely on technologies we don't understand all the time, from laptops to cell phones to cars to whatever. I mean, when those things do have secrets. I mean, it's in general. So that said, I put a lot of effort into making sure that the resulting arithmetic is something anybody with a junior high school education could follow. You could do the math. You could do the number crunching with a pencil and paper. It only involves multiplication. Right. It's like that's all that's involved, but the proof that does the right thing. It's available. You can read it. It's not a secret.
I guess what I'm thinking
Yeah.
of is not necessarily a detailed understanding of the equations, but maybe an intuitive understanding of
Right.
what this is all about. Enough of an understanding that if something was being done seriously,
Well,
that
so
might be following the procedure to the letter, but somehow wasn't in the spirit of the
Or
thing.
feel that they were following.
So
Yeah.
trying to provide that, in part through metaphors and in part, like the ballot polling being like an exit poll. I
That's
think
great.
people kind of understand, and I
Yeah.
think people also understand that if you want to know whether a pot of soup has too much salt, and we can think of salt as an analog for error in, you know, in the contest, it's enough to taste a tablespoon, provided you stir it up really well. You gotta stir it up really well, or the tablespoon might not be representative.
Right.
But a tablespoon's enough, and a tablespoon's enough whether it's a 1-quart saucepan or a 50-gallon cauldron. What matters is that you stir it first, and so that's the random sampling. You know, you stir up the election, and you take out a tablespoon of ballots, and they tell you something about the whole election if you do it. You know, if you really do the stirring. So,
All right, let me go back to that, because that's getting back to the question I was asking this afternoon.
Yeah.
And let's imagine that your soup has lumps in it.
mhm.
And even though you stir it, it still has lumps in it.
You do
You
have to stir
actually
it.
puree it.
Yeah, you actually puree it.
Right. If you're talking clam chowder, right, so there are little chunks of potato, little chunks of clam. In order to do this, we have to puree it. You can't just do that because you could have hidden a bunch of salt
Inside a potato.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. So the random sampling is
So
actually
what,
pureeing.
try to
Pureeing and then
explain in my idiot terms how you puree it.
Is that the random number?
You're taking individual ballots at random from the entire election.
Individual ballots.
Individual ballots at random from the entire
So you're
election.
really sampling the soup at the molecular level.
Yeah.
So you're not taking a few samples from this precinct, like they do in the 1%? You're taking them from
The whole election, the whole contest.
Right.
the whole
From the whole
contest?
county.
That's a
The whole
difference.
For each,
the whole
for each
state.
contest that you are auditing, you are taking it from the contest. If
Right,
it's a
if you-
statewide contest, you're taking it from the state.
Okay, if you're looking at just a school board where we've seen in San Jose, 2 people, 2 ballots difference, two vote difference between a winner and a loser in a 3-point.
So the math would tell you, you have to look at all the ballots, because that margin is so small.
Yeah.
That you basically are gonna have to drink all the soup. That is, you know, because one molecule of salt is gonna kill you in that particular brew.
Right.
So,
And you probably have to count them twice, because if you're out by 2 ballots, you
You
could
won't-
be off
yeah,
by
you
him counting it, right? I mean,
so
you really might have
the
to.
math basically says the smaller the margin, the more ballots you need to look at, because a smaller amount of soup is harmful, of salt is harmful. And even doing the math ahead of time would tell you that in that situation, you might as well just cut to the chase and count it all by hand, because the size of the sample you're gonna need to look at is gonna be more expensive than simply counting it by hand.
Right.
By the way, introduction, sharing screen.
Has to be-
I had seen you before down in Palo Alto with Dr. Dell.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, but,
You know, the fundraiser for verified voting or something.
It was verified voting, but
Yeah.
it's a long trip for me.
No, thank you for helping.
Thank you for fighting traffic. That's
Thank you for bringing these. These are great.
Thank you for the cookies.
And the
Oh,
cookies,
you're
by the
welcome.
way.
Those were made this morning.
Excellent.
I
Looks like
messed
they're
them
old.
up.
Is that
Yeah.
They're not my perfect ones.
There's
Who
definitely.
eats seconds anytime?
Yeah, the thing I noticed when I saw you doing it in Alameda County a few years ago was I couldn't understand why you're getting this ballot from this box and some other ballot from another box.
Because
and-
what we're doing is the moral equivalent of putting them all into a cement mixer, stirring them up,
Yeah,
and then taking however many dozen out.
okay.
So we sort of made a list of all of the ballots, picked however many it was at random, and then said, where are they? Well,
Okay.
this one is in box 1, this one is in box 17, this one is in box whatever. That's the pureeing
That
process.
was the random
That's
part
helpful.
of it.
Yeah.
The puree analogy helps a great deal, thank you.
That gets them into,
I think we have to come up with a new method called puree. This is
Just when they're
political,
Puree.
unbiased, recounts, risk enumeration, something like that. It's great. It's very good.
I have a few questions from the election officer point of view. I'm a commissioner for Santa Clara County.
Okay.
I know nothing about discriminating audits. I do know how our registrar of voters operates. Sometimes I don't like the way they operate, and you have to read the latest.
I'm sure you've got something.
we'll stop by 30 and then you can.
Yeah, that later. Coming layperson's point of view, I would say, have you met with any of the election officers around the state?
Oh, yeah, I've now worked with,
Santa Clara
with close
County
to
or-
20 of them. I haven't worked with Santa Clara, but I've worked with, I'm going to start in the south. Ventura, San Luis Obispo, Monterey, Santa Cruz,
Orange, Stanislaus, Alameda, Merced, Humboldt.
okay,
Yolo.
and Yolo, and then I visited
Sacramento.
Sacramento. I visited a number of them, and I've addressed the CACEO a couple of times, their legislative group once. I had conversations with a number of other jurisdictions, including San Francisco, John Arts there, about auditing. So I've been talking to them a lot.
So, do
Humboldt
they
and San Francisco.
tend to understand it at all as election
Yeah.
officers? 'Cause
Orange, oh, actually left out Orange.
Orange.
Orange is, yeah, and they're like very much on board. The more progressive ones see this as a way to accomplish two things: get a better guarantee that the outcome is right, and to do it with less effort than the 1%, usually, unless there's a problem, in which case it's going to be more effort than the 1% because you're going to end up counting all the ballots. Right?
That's right, you should have
1% is meaningless. so-
And the 1% doesn't do it, yeah.
Yeah, it's meaningless, yeah.
Right.
And then, have they given you any feedback on
Yeah, so,
how it would work with their individual systems? I know Orange County has a lot of different,
they're using
things
part,
that it does.
part of it, figuring out how to operationalize it in a particular jurisdiction is understanding their work processes and their paper flow. And a lot of
Yeah.
the difficulty in doing this right now is because the legacy voting systems suck. I mean, they just do. They don't even export the results in a usable format, much less do it at the level of individual ballots. So what I see the path forward as being, as quickly as possible, get legislation in place that requires better ballot accounting, that really gives you much stronger assurance that you've got all the paper and only the right paper and it hasn't been altered.
Is anyone working on that legislation?
Well, yeah, when I saw you guys in Sacramento, Mullen, Assemblyman Member Mullen, just proposed legislation, AB 44, that would start that ball rolling. It was in the context of recounts, but it applies more generally.
Oh, okay. I hadn't-
So, I haven't really had any contact with the new Secretary of State yet. I'm expecting that's going to happen, relatively soon through verified voting or something else, but that hasn't happened yet. But trying to get good regulations to just curate the audit trail well and be able to demonstrate that you curate it well. So that's the first thing. Second thing would be do ballot polling audits for large contests like statewide contests, because all those requires the paper. They don't require any special properties of the voting system. They don't have to be able to export records, they don't have to be involved. You can just do it. But you need to know how much paper you have and how it's organized.
Can you
So
say
that
a
would-
little bit more about that, how this works across multiple jurisdictions?
Yeah, it's the same way. It's the pureeing process. You puree across jurisdictions. You puree the entire state. It's,
It's,
You talked about, for example, if you determine you need 1,000 ballots from the state, and you know that a quarter of the ballots are from LA County, you ask LA County for 250, sort of a stratified sample?
well, no, actually, I would do it the other way to start, which is I would simply draw 1,000 ballots from the state.
From the entire state, and
And then
let
it would
LA
probably
County know
be
which
that
ones are
LA
theirs.
would
Okay.
get roughly a quarter of them,
Mhm.
because they have
Okay.
roughly a quarter of the voters. But
You would do that drawing by how? I
you
can't
need the
visualize.
jurisdictions to tell you how many ballots they have.
Okay.
And then you conceptually number them. So if Alameda County has, for the sake of argument, 1 million ballots, I'm going to number those Alameda 1 through Alameda 1,000,000. And then if Los Angeles County has whatever it is, 4 million, if they're going to number them LA 1 through LA 4 million. And then I'm going to put the counties in alphabetically for the sake of argument. And do we have anything before Alameda in the alphabet?
No, I don't think so.
All right, so we'd be
I think
first.
it's the first.
First among equals. And so if I drew And now so now I've got, whatever it is, 12 million ballots for the state or something like that. It's 8 million, 9 million, it's not that big.
Probably 9.
Yeah, I think it's like 9 million for the state or presidential election. So,
Conceptually,
and
we
then
can
so conceptually, you imagine putting them all into an enormous cement mixer and stirring them up and saying, I want ballot number, 5,290. Oh, that's Alameda County's ballot number, blah, blah, blah. Go get it. And then I'd want ballot number,
I think the missing piece here is how you know you want that ballot number goes back to your random number generation, which
Yeah.
I think we kind of missed
Yeah.
that step.
so
how you know you pick-
conceptually, you are numbering the ballots from 1 to the total number in the state.
Right.
And then
And
do
then
you
you're sort-
physically have that ballot sent to you wherever you are in this central location?
No, I would,
You
the
get
the
them
county,
to-
the county would, logistically, I would imagine that the county would pull the ballot with public observers
Uh,
and show it around people in the room, which is what we've typically done, and see, what do you see here? I see a vote for Lincoln. Okay, everybody agree it's a vote for Lincoln? Yes. And then, phone home, or that can also be done, with webcam, where you can actually watch everybody, doing this process and demonstrating that that's what the ballot really shows.
Okay, so that's another opportunity for public participation.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
But to know which numbers you go after is that number generator that you talked about earlier.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you
And-
randomly start with one number and then you generate a number of numbers and you pick.
And for
How do you know you
statewide,
pick 1,000? I mean, you pick.
well, you
that-
don't, that's the point. You
Oh,
don't, until you
okay.
look at them, you don't
keep-
know when you can stop.
Okay.
But you might be able to reasonably anticipate that you're gonna need at least 1,000, and so you can start with that.
Okay.
And then if things are favorable, you won't need to look at more, and if things are unfavorable, if you uncovered errors or whatnot, you'll say, okay, LA County, I need these other 10 ballots that you haven't pulled yet. And with luck, I'll be able to stop them, and at some point, you'll go, you know what? We're just finding errors or whatnot, there's a lot of trouble, we might as well just count them all.
So
No, I know in programming, if you find errors in a particular subroutine, that's where you look for more errors. So if you find errors in ballots in LA County, do you get more from LA County or more from the state?
So the method I was just talking about, I was misspeaking because you're not even really looking for errors. You're looking for what does the ballot say?
Right.
For that, it's clear that you want to have that in proportion to the number of voters in each place, basically, right? So it's just, you have more voters in LA, you're gonna end up picking more
Yeah,
ballots
but
from
if a
LA.
specific county is getting higher than average number of overstatements, as you call it.
Well, we're talking about a different thing, right? We're talking about ballot polling, which is not an overstatement or understatement. It's just, does it say Lincoln or does it say somebody? Who does it say? You're not comparing it to anything. There's no error.
All right,
Yeah.
well, yeah, but if you expect it to say Lincoln and you get Washington, then you gotta,
But we have no
You have
expectation.
no expectation.
For this procedure.
This is
that
the
we're talking
ballot
about.
polling, not the
Yeah.
ballot verification.
So
I
we're
mean,
not,
you would expect some, if you happen to pull one from Orange County, you would expect it to be a Republican vote. But, but that's just, but it might not be.
so this
I
is
mean,
like an
it-
exit poll thing, April, May, you're
Yeah.
exit polling the ballots.
Yeah.
and-
yes,
Yeah.
Okay.
Statewide.
yeah.
So
That's it.
at this point, you're really talking about like effective AB 44 and
Well, AB 44
as it
won't
deals
quite.
with a state issue. But what happens when it comes down to a county?
Well, so this is where I'm saying, right, step one, get better ballot accounting, get better rules around that. Step two, once you've got that, you can do ballot polling audits for large contests relatively efficiently, especially if the margin isn't microscopic. Step three, make it a rule that any new voting equipment that gets purchased support ballot level comparison audits. And those make it cheap.
Okay,
Right,
make
and that's the
that-
point.
That, it's, so make sure that on any new system,
Supports ballot level
supports
comparison audits.
ballot
And,
level,
comparison audits.
And that's what we've been talking about.
That's what we've been talking about.
I'm sure I
We're
understand
talking
that.
about comparison, okay.
But that's where you say, the
That's-
system said, I interpreted this as a vote for Lincoln,
Right.
where's the paper, does it say Lincoln? Right,
See,
that is a different thing, then you do have the expectation.
Right, okay.
Okay.
But
How
the
are you
reason,
deciding between ballot polling and comparison?
The trade-off is this: ballot polling only needs paper that you've kept track of. Okay, but the workload for doing so that there's very little upfront cost. You don't need a fancy voting system that will export its cast vote records or this or that. You just need ballots. You just need. However, when the margin gets small, the number of ballots you have to touch grows basically in inverse proportion to the square of the margin. So if you cut the margin, in half, you quadruple the number of ballots you need to look at, roughly. Right? If you divide the margin by 10, you multiply by 100 the number of ballots you need to look at.
Right.
It becomes very expensive very quickly.
Yeah.
The advantage of the comparison audits is that the workload grows roughly linearly in their cycle. If you cut the margin in half, you double the workload. You divide the margin by 10, you multiply the workload by 10. Roughly speaking, this is all on the assumption that the outcome is right, not that the outcome is wrong. But the difficulty is that in order to be able to do a ballot level comparison audit, you need not only the stuff you needed for the ballot polling audit, namely ballots that you've kept track of, so forth and so on, you also need the voting system to tell you how it interpreted each piece of paper. And you need it to do that in such a way that you can match that interpretation to the piece of paper and compare them. Right. And that is something that no current federally certified voting system does.
Wow. And that's where we want to be.
That's what we
I'm
want.
asking this because.
And that's what the vendors in Colorado are claiming to be able to do, all 5 of them.
And they are doing that, or no?
No, they're claiming they are claiming that. Yeah.
Because my county is working on an RFP right now
Okay.
for a new system. And I have my clause in,
Yeah. So,
And,
but
because-
I should mention one other thing. The Travis County, Texas RFP for the Star Vote system is going out next week.
Star vote
They're building a new system.
We're building a new
like
system
LA,
from
but-
scratch. That'll be auditable.
in Travis County?
Oh, and
Austin,
Yeah.
Austin, Texas, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I still have this thing that I mentioned in programming. If we find more errors in a particular subroutine, that's where we look
Mhm.
to find even more errors.
Mhm.
We don't look everywhere else where other programmers did it right, If you start finding errors in a particular area, you need more from that area, because it isn't a completely stirred,
Well,
whatever.
Well, it depends. You can do it in a way that only stirs within areas, and then those methods behave the way you're saying. If you would escalate, if I'm sampling, doing a stratified sample,
Yeah.
where I'm choosing some particular number of ballots from Alameda County, and they're doing their work, and I'm picking some number from LA County, and they're doing their work, those audits might, if LA starts to find a bunch of errors, they might need to escalate without Alameda. But if we're talking about the pureed election,
Right.
everything is drawn from the entire population. Now, for election forensics, at the end of the day, you might say, gosh, we found a bunch of errors that came from this particular voting system, or this particular
Right.
precinct, or this particular county, or whatever, and I want to go back and do some check. But meanwhile, you still have the statistical guarantee that no matter whether the errors are in fact concentrated in one place, or spread out evenly, or all in one precinct, or whatever it is, if the outcome is wrong, you have a big chance of correcting it.
I'm sorry, she got the wrong bathroom.
Still later.
We won't tell anybody.
Yeah, we rent out the main bedroom and bathrooms.
I see.
We try not to use that.
They're back.
Oh, well, stuff happens.
Okay, but anyway.